I was in the bath one night and I was thinking to myself, will it ever stop raining? Do you know, I was in the bath and I was listening to the rain outside. It was pelting on the window pane of the bathroom. And there's something very, very pleasurable about having a bath in the rain on a cold winter's night. And then the clocks change, and you would imagine we should be into the summer. And there I was in the bath, thinking about the rain. And then you start worrying about climate change. I come up then to Donegal to do a bit of work because I'm working on a new book. And it's going reasonably well. Now, I'm only about halfway through it and it's due for publication in October. So keep your eye out for a new book in October. But going reasonably well, so I came up here to do a few days' work and what do I get? Rain. Rain and wind, and it's like, God, will it ever end? And I acknowledge to myself that I'm a writer. I'm not dependent on this, you know. I'm not a farmer looking to grow vegetables. But it does scare me. It makes me feel fragile. And then if I layer on top of that all the other things that can make me feel fragile, you know, there's so much stuff. I was thinking, when I come up now, I have a little laptop here, I stick it into a screen here. I can bring it home, and at home I have another screen, I stick it in there. And I'm able to move around as a writer in a very serious way. But in the old days, I remember the first time that a fella said to me, way back in the 70s, we were young and I was writing poems and he had been to school with me and we were out one night in Cavan at the Farnham Hotel and he says to me, what do you use for writing? I said, I use a manual typewriter. And he said, do you know they're making a computer now so that you can write it with a computer? I said, really? Is that a fact? Yeah, he said, and you'll be able to write, you could write a full book into the screen of the computer, he said. It's like a television. But you'd be using it like a typewriter. And he said they're going to have a situation where you could write a whole book into it and then you could get chapters of the book and take them out at the end of the book and put them in the front of the book, or you could take out sentences and completely take out the sentence and just press a button and it'll go somewhere else. And I thought he was talking science fiction. I loved the manual, physical sense of a typewriter. To me, it was like a loom. I always held on to that image, you know, that the weaver has a loom and that I was a storyteller and that I was weaving stories on the typewriter, so it was like a loom. And then there came the moment, I'll tell you actually, at that time, even as late as the late 1980s, I was still using that manual typewriter. And on one occasion, I wanted to write a book which ended up as The Trouble with Sarah Gullion. It was published by Blackstaff Press. And I wrote that book. It was a book about the Troubles and about Fermanagh, and so I wanted to be close to it. I came to Donegal and I rented a chalet near the airport in Carrickfinn, and I was there for about 6 or 7 months. And I used to come up on the bus. I would cycle into town in Dublin, and I'd have the typewriter. It was like a box that you'd put a musical instrument, like an accordion in. And I would have that on the back of the bike, and I'd cycle into town. I would get McGinley's bus from outside, I think it was called the Royal Hotel, just at the end of O'Connell Street. And that would bring me to Letterkenny. And then sometimes you transferred into a smaller bus because there'd be less people going to West Donegal. So you'd transferred the bicycle and the typewriter into the second bus, and that would bring you from Letterkenny to Annagary. When you got to Annagary, you'd get out and put your typewriter on the carrier seat of the bike and strap it with there was a big, strong, elastic thing and a hook on either end. Everybody had one of them for tying things to the back of your bicycle. And you would then cycle with that 2 or 3 kilometres out the road to Carrickfinn. So that's the way I used to carry around my typewriter. When we got married, I got a real big lift and upgrade to a golf ball typewriter, we used to call it, because there was a little thing like a golf ball at the centre, so that instead of a splay of the letters, the alphabet, moving slowly and mechanically with the force of your finger, this system was you had the keyboard, and when you pressed a letter, the golf ball automatically jumped and put that letter onto the paper. Obviously, you had to have a flex and a plug for it, and that meant that because when I got married first, I was working in a coal shed. There was no other place to work. It was a small house. We had a child, young baby. So I put a window. I knocked a hole in the coal shed, put in a window, and then I put in a floor and a ceiling of wood, tongue and groove, did it myself. I never did anything like that before, and I really enjoyed doing it. Had it all done up. It was very small. It was about nearly the size of 2 or 3 telephone kiosks put together. It was about, 1.5 metres by 1.5 metres. But I could sit in there with a tiny little table and 2 coats and a woolen hat, and then there was a flex would come from a plug in the kitchen, out the window, across the yard and in under the door. And then I'd have 2 plug points on the adapter. I'd have one for the not computer, but from the electric typewriter, and one for a heater. And that's the way I wrote. Certainly I wrote 2 plays at least for the Abbey Theatre, including a play called Unapuka and Sour Grapes. In fact, Sour Grapes was the one that I really wrote in that little coal shed. So that's the way I came up as a writer. And then eventually you have this situation where I can come up here with a little laptop, plug it into a screen, and I have everything I need. I go home, maybe on a Friday night or a Saturday, and I have a screen there. I plug the same laptop in, and I have all my stuff. Everything I ever wrote, everything I ever needed, all in that one little laptop goes in the back of a backpack. I'll be going on the Camino soon. I'll have the little computer with me, walking along towards Santiago de Compostela, and every evening I'll be able to take it out and work, because that's the way you do it now. So that's one thing. That's a measure to me of how the world has changed. And up until very recently, probably until COVID, I thought everything was looking good, I remember reading a book by a philosopher called Steven Pinker, and it was all positive about the future. It was like, we've never had it so good. We're getting rid of poverty, we're getting rid of wars, and we have so much technology, and it's all going to even accelerate more. So I was thinking, well, it's a great time to be alive. We're really blessed. It's something to be grateful for. And then, probably, I don't know, maybe I wasn't paying attention, but from COVID onwards, it seems to have been 4 years of one terrible disaster after another coming for us. There's war in Europe, and there's a terrible war in the Middle East, and it looks like it could get worse. And everybody's crying about artificial intelligence, AI. People are saying, well, this is the worst thing that ever happened, and they'll be able to clone personalities and have what they call counterfeit people. So one of the big crimes in the old days was having counterfeit money, right? Like people had been using money, but they had made it themselves and it was false. Now they can actually, you could see somebody on screen and you could talk to them like on FaceTime, and it might be that they are visually in front of you, and it might be that you know them, like this is maybe your sister or your brother, and yet it could be an artificially constructed image with the sort of intelligence that is now available in computers. So the confusion that would bring into the world is a confusion that would stop people trusting each other. And maybe that has happened more than we realize among young people. I mean, I'm always surprised how passionate young people are now about certain political causes. Young people can call themselves activists, and they can be very committed to any number of causes, whether it be politics or social justice, whatever. And you'd admire them for that, and you'd think, well, that's great. But you'd also sometimes, when you'd see them protesting or on television or on YouTube or on TikTok, whatever, you'd be thinking like, Jesus, they're getting very serious, very angry, very excited in themselves about their point of view. And that leads you to the culture wars, to, this thing of whether you can have freedom of speech at all, or whether you should have laws to stop people speaking freely, because maybe my free speech is making you feel uncomfortable, and maybe in some sense that's an aggression against you. Maybe in some sense I'm saying things that could stir hate against you because of your gender, your sexuality, your religion, your identity, whatever. So you can see there's an awful breakdown in trust. And I used to think, 30 years ago, when you could see that institutional religion was somewhere on the decline because the clergy were beginning to vanish, I used to think the one danger when you take away religion is that people will turn to nationalism. Because people need meaning. People need to believe in something. People need to be part of some collective. And I suppose I was wrong about nationalism, although to be fair, it is interesting how Brexit and also politics in Ireland do suggest the rise of a new sense of kind of identity as a nation. And you get it, I suppose, in Europe as well. Far-right parties are very prone to identify themselves as the voice of the nation. All those flags that you might see at rallies in Barcelona or in Berlin or in Belturbet, wherever. Not maybe Belturbet, okay. But all those flags of the nation, I would have never imagined that now 30 or 40 years ago. I would have thought that we're gone away from that nationalism. But then maybe if you let go of the religious idea, religion gathers people together. It's one of the things I love about it. I'm a person that that enjoys religion. You know, I enjoy it with an enthusiasm. I don't get myself locked into rules and regulations about going to mass or church. I go when the Spirit moves me to go. And that doesn't mean that I'm being self-indulgent, but I'm just not kind of doing it every Sunday because I think you should do it every Sunday. But I do love when I go sometimes now on the Camino, and I'll be doing the Camino in about 3 weeks' time, first week in May. I'm hugely looking forward to it, and I'll be podcasting from Spain as I'm walking. But, you know, I get a huge enthusiasm from being out there in the world. It's beautiful. I belong to the Christian faith. When I'm at Mass and the bread is broken, the chalice is raised, and I'm thinking, this is the risen Christ. This is the cosmic Christ. This is my consciousness in this moment is falling into the great presence of Christ. And then I go up to the altar and I receive the communion with this body and blood of Christ. And I feel that I'm united now. My own sense of consciousness is dissolving into a greater, bigger, wider consciousness of compassion, and is manifesting in the person in front of me in the line, in the person the minister who's given out the communion, in the people shoulder to shoulder with me in the pew. I feel, and we're in silent prayer after communion, and I feel it's like floating in the ocean of love. It's like so wonderful to be present in that moment. And I belong to those other people. And that's what religion does for me, you know. And to be honest, I got the same, and still do, from Jampeling, because it's a Buddhist centre. It's not a centre of ideology. Again, it's simply a structure, a building, where the people who stayed there and lived there are devoted to prayer. They're devoted to meditation, to being still and paying attention to the deep kind of love and compassion that resonates in the universe. What an amazing thing, like, you know. And it doesn't matter. You can argue about the words. You can argue about what prayer means or what meditation means. But you know it when you see it. And you know that when you go to somewhere like that, like Jampeling, you're having the same experience as you do when you go to a church. You're getting an experience of belonging. If I sit down for a cup of tea with somebody in Jampeling, we're not meeting as two isolated individuals. We are meeting as two people in human form who have recognized that we share a bigger, greater, conscious compassion. We experience it individually. If I bring my mind into my heart and I feel love for you or for any other sentient being, this sense of almost physically being aware with your heart of what's around you, So we do that, we're having a cup of coffee, and there is a bond between us. And that's what I'd say church means. And if you have that, if you have a shared church, if you have somewhere you can gather that's to do with the ultimate idea of God, I suppose, the ultimate, the ultimate idea of where everything that is comes from. How is it that this is? The idea of being. And it doesn't have to be a God in one particular sense. It doesn't have to be a whole lot of gods. It doesn't have to be a male God or a female God. It doesn't have to be, a Buddha in any particular form. But you still know what people are talking about when they talk about faith. I used to use the phrase, the mentor deity. If you go back about 2 years when I was doing podcasting, I always used to talk about the mentor deity. The mentor deity is, if you like, an archetypal figure in your consciousness, in your own particular consciousness, who you make your teacher. I think that's the key to whether you want to live a Christian life or a Buddhist life or in any religion. There needs to be a moment where you turn to your mentor deity and say, today I live for you, or today I live acknowledging that you are the ground of all being. And that's not to say, you're not saying like there is a category of being in the universe floating around, a being. I heard this explained very beautifully recently. The idea of God is not the idea of a category. It's not a being. It is being. So it's not an objective being, like an extra thing in the universe that's bigger and more powerful than everything else. It's the very being of the universe itself. That's what everybody's talking about. That's what every religion talks about. The ultimate nature of reality. The tree outside my window. Everything. The ultimate nature of how it is held together. Even on science programs, I was listening to Melvin Bragg in Our Time on BBC Radio 4 recently, and one of the programs he did just after Christmas was on panpsychism. Panpsychism. That's psych as in psychology, panpsychism. And if you go and search that, it's a brilliant program, but there you have 3 scientists, and they're talking about the nature of matter. They're talking about the nature of reality, material reality, and the question of consciousness. And they're trying to figure out, as scientists do, what is the relationship between consciousness and matter. In the old days, you might have said, what's the relationship between body and soul? Because you're there. You know you are there. I know I'm here. But what is being here about in that way of being conscious? And is it just some, sweat that comes off our brains? Or does it have a dimension of reality with its own ground? Or is the way that our material bodies develop actually, to some extent, determined by the spiritual side of us? To use a cliche that everybody says, we are not material beings with a spiritual aspect. We are spiritual beings with a material aspect. But what is the relationship between the two? I don't know, you don't know, Melvin Bragg doesn't know. So all we can do is either leave it there and ignore it and just live a secular life and end up with the danger of having no meaning. Or else you go and find meaning somewhere else, like in politics, being an activist, social justice advocate. There's different ways to find meaning. Some people find meaning in their family, some find it in their work. If you find it in your family, I would say, I suppose, that is another type of church. I would say that's my church. You know, like, I stand outside institutions, whether they're Christian institutions or Buddhist institutions. I can go to the Eucharist and feel a complete adherence to the mystery of that, and to the creed, and to the whole idea of that church. And I can feel sad when the church officials, the clergy, don't behave well, and now we're in this time of decline. But I can go to any group like that. I can go to Jampeling, and again, it's a church. It's a community. And I can feel a deep sense of belonging, sitting having a cup of coffee with somebody. And I can enjoy that very much as a spiritual experience, as the necessary manifestation of my private life. And there's no way that you can be following Christianity without going into a church. I was in a church yesterday. I was in Letterkenny, and I was just passing the church, and I just went in for 5 minutes. And those 5 minutes are the most important minutes in the day. And if I feel I want to maintain a sense of belonging with the community in Jampeling, then every so often, maybe every 6 months. There was a time I used to be over there 2 and 3 times a week in Jampeling, in West Cavan, Tibetan Buddhist Centre. But not now. I've moved on. I'm in a different place. I'm in a different space. But I still keep a huge attachment with it, because the Rinpoche, the Lama, the teacher who resides there, is a very, very important person, a very wise teacher, but he is my teacher. He is the person that I committed myself to learn from 30 years ago. And obviously the Catholic Church is the church that I was ordained into, baptized into, ordained into. An enormous privilege. An enormous, it gives me such gratefulness. I would never go back on any of those things. To belong to a community, to belong to a church, you don't have to talk. You know, it's not like everybody has to get up and say, my name is Joe and this is why I'm a Christian. You can go into the back of the church. You can be in the side. I was at a funeral during the week. In my parish church in Leitrim. And again, it's not somewhere I go very often. Maybe I haven't been there for, maybe a couple of months, maybe since the last funeral. But when I go, I put my finger in the water font, and I bless myself. I make this sign of a cross from my, forehead to the stomach and the shoulders. And I do it with meaning because I'm going into my church. And these neighbours that I don't see for weeks, but we share the same little territory of the parish. I'm making my journey to God, not alone, but with other people, and it's them. They are my community. And I remember, again, going back to the Buddhist, the Lama, the Rinpoche, one time when he was given a lecture, beautiful lecture on compassion, and then everybody was grateful and thankful, and he said, well, thank you very much, he said, so if we practice these things, these teachings, we will get closer to enlightenment. And then he said, of course, we won't reach enlightenment on our own, but, and he pointed at everybody in the room, but all together. You know, so you're saying like, okay, I'm a big Lama, I'm a big wise guy up here. I studied since I was about 5 years of age in monasteries in Tibet, and now I'm here. So I might be very, very far ahead in terms of discipline and study. But you are my community now. You are my monks. You are my brothers and sisters. And if we ever get to enlightenment, and this is a very high Lama, you know. Like he's the Panchen Utra Lama. He was a candidate to become Panchen Lama, like the Dalai Lama, the very high, and he's a friend of the Dalai Lama. And here he was saying, well, if we study, if we practice these teachings, we will get closer to enlightenment. But I won't be going on my own. I won't get there on my own. I will only get there if and when we all get there. And that's the same when I go into the Catholic Church, my parish church. I belong so deeply there that when I turn in my heart to the mentor deity, when I allow myself to surrender into the greater presence, the great conscious presence that manifests in the body and blood of Jesus Christ, I'm not doing it on my own. I'm doing it in the acknowledgement that everybody in the parish is going to get there together. We're all going to be together. I mean, you can hear it in this, you know, those hymns. Yes, we will gather by the river. Always there's a sense that we will do it together. We will not be isolated. And if you were to ask me, what is your church then? You know, the word church, by the way, it comes from the Hebrew. In the Old Testament, there's a phrase that comes again and again, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but it's the kahel Yahweh, the gathering of God, of Yahweh. So it's like in the prophets and in the scriptures of the Old Testament, there are many, many places where the prophets talk about how Yahweh, God, gathers a people to himself. Gathers a people to himself. It was the two ideas that came into the world really through Abraham. One was the singularity of God, because up until that moment, many, many cultures would have been happy with the idea that there are many gods, and sometimes our God fights your God and our God wins and so forth. What Abraham realizes in his spiritual journey is that there is one God. Now, it's like not saying there's one God in one place and that's it, but it's like there is nothing but God. That when the scientists ask the question of matter and spirit, the Christian answer, the Jewish answer, and the Islamic answer is that the ground of all being is this conscious compassion. And I've been saying this word in this podcast, conscious compassion, because even scientists are coming around to that sense that, the harmony that is needed for the entire universe to just exist can in itself be called an act of love. Being together, all them little atoms, on precise frequencies of compatibility, are in themselves the essence of love. The idea that consciousness is not just individual in you and me, but it may be a singularity that we share in, is a very beautiful door that opens you into prayer. All you have to do is actually do nothing to pray. I know I talk sometimes about there being a threshold, right? A threshold, and you sit there and you do your meditation and you get single-pointed meditation, or you sit in the back of a church, or you look at a lake, or you do it whatever way you want to get to a space of serenity and samadhi, as they say in the Hindu, samadhi. And you're there in this really tranquil, calm, focused silence. And then I say there is a threshold beyond that where you encounter your mentor deity. You begin to realize that there is a presence already there. And I use the word threshold as like going over a threshold. And that to some extent sounds like I'm saying, so you're meditating and you're in still-pointed, single-pointed stillness, and now you need to get your mind to go somewhere else, go over some threshold. And that's not the case. It's the opposite. It's the God comes across the threshold to you. All you have to do, all I have to do, is be still. If I am still, I will hear God speak. Now, if I'm not open to that, if I don't recognize there's a threshold, I'm going to be still, but I won't hear anything. I'll only kind of get full of my own inflated sense of greatness, that how marvelous I am that I can keep my mind still. But there's a really strong idea about the word grace. That grace is like that we don't initiate anything. When you are still, be still, the Old Testament says, be still and know that I am God. Right? So the initiative is always coming from God. And our response is always to listen, to be open, and to be grateful that there is a personal depth that's reaching out to us in this moment. That we're in a dialogue and we didn't begin it. We didn't initiate it. It's an invitation. That's the most powerful sense of prayer. Aligned to it is that we don't do it on our own. Now, it doesn't mean, for some it does mean, join a prayer meeting, prayer group, which used to be fierce fashionable when I was in my 20s. God, there was prayer meetings everywhere. I mean, we used to enjoy going to prayer meetings like for social fun. There'd be women at them as well. And they were very intimate. Prayer meetings were intimate. You'd see people nowadays and they're in pubs and the noise of the music is so loud, you'd wonder, how can they get intimate with each other? And then maybe you think, maybe that's why they want to have sexual intimacy, because they need intimacy. And so sexual intimacy, in some ways, the only way I can get intimate with you is go to bed with you. And then what we're seeing, I think, in Western culture now is that they're not going to bed with each other either, young people, because there's been a decline in intimacy. There's been a decline in everything to do with... It's like sexual intimacy was an expression of spiritual union or spiritual intimacy. But when you take it away and make an object of it in itself, sexuality, the younger generation lose interest. And one of the great diseases that they talk about in the West now is loneliness among young people and the lack of intimacy. Now, when we were young and we'd be in Sligo, let's say, and the Trades Club would be on a music venue with a kind of a left-wing slant to it, it was a great place for musicians sitting around in a circle playing flutes, banjos, guitars, accordions. Beautiful. Every week, about twice a week, the Trades Club. Used to love going to it from about 10 or half 10 at night for about 2 hours. But beforehand, again, possibly twice a week, maybe on a Thursday night, in different places there would be prayer meetings. Maybe in the Mercy Convent, maybe in the church, different places. And people would come into a room and there'd be 40 people maybe. And they would share prayer. So they'd be sharing like the intimacy that you have in the privacy of your own mind, the privacy that you have with your God. You'd actually express it with your voice in the company of others. And this developed a kind of a bond similar to what you will get in that kind of evangelical, born-again Christianity that's been around now for hundreds of years. And it is very similar to, I think, what it might have been like in the early decades of the Christian tradition, when people would gather in somebody's house and everybody, let's say, was Jewish, and they would have a Jewish ritual, and then it would evolve into readings or sharing memories about Jesus and trying to interpret what happened to him in the light of the Old Testament scriptures, and then turning to prayer. And prayer of the heart, prayer with such enthusiasm, because when you pray like that in a prayer meeting, it's beautiful, because it's like intimate. Do you know what I'm saying? There's a real intimacy. You're expressing something hugely intimate about your own emotions within you, and to share them publicly in a group, it's kind of courageous in one sense. It takes courage, but it builds a great bond of togetherness. And I suppose it's also related to the idea of the Holy Spirit, that the charismatic prayer movement used to be very much about the idea that the Spirit of the Lord was upon us. That in Pentecost, that idea of where Jesus goes through Good Friday, where you have a realization of resurrection, then you have a sense that he has moved away from us. He's, as we knew Jesus, he is no longer here. He's gone. And there's this anticipation that in some way the full transformation is completed when we experience within ourselves the Spirit of God. We experience in ourselves a sense that we now are Christ. Christ is in us. And that journey in the church is 80 days. You're talking 40 days up to Easter Sunday. But what a lot of people forget then is we move into this huge important time of Pentecost from Easter Sunday for 40 days until Pentecost Sunday. You're thinking about the resurrection. You're experiencing the resurrection in your life. And you're thinking about what the full completion of this transition means, the sense that the Spirit of God is in you, is in me. And not in a churchy way, just in, I'm just a man here sitting at a desk talking into a microphone, but the Spirit of God is upon me. That's what Pentecost means, and that's a really big, exciting thing. It's the kind of expression, it's like prayer is where you're receiving. Or the light of the Buddha is shining into your soul. There's beautiful visualizations people do in Tibetan Buddhism where they visualize the Buddha before them, and then there's a light comes from the Buddha, from the heart of the Buddha, right? Visualizing like a tube of white light coming from the heart of the Buddha into the crown chakra, into the very top of your head, and then the light goes in through that crown chakra, down through your head, your neck, your arms, your heart, your stomach, your feet, your toes, and it fills you with radiant light. It's a visualization you do slowly, gradually. It's very powerful. And the light comes into your body and fills your whole being, entering each pore with the strength of a diamond, creating a Vajra field, a diamond field, protecting you against negative energy and allowing through positive energy. That's a visualization, part of Tara practice, very well worth looking at. And it can also be done. There's no problem to do it if your mentor deity is the Christ. And taking an icon of Christ and visualizing Christ so that the icon is not just on the wood, but the icon is in your mind. And experiencing that same light of Christ coming into you. Now that's one part of the practice, but the other part, the complementary part to that, let's say in the Buddhist tradition, is always visualizing light rays from within you going out in the 10 directions, reaching out like hooks to gather in every single sentient being in the entire cosmos into the Buddha. So therefore you become the Buddha. Buddha sends the light to you, light fills you up, you're transformed into light, and then you send this rays of light in the 10 directions out into the universe. Comes in, then it goes out. It's very, very beautiful. The Christian shape of Easter to Pentecost is precisely the same. The mentor deity is different. The particular ideas about the revelation of God in Jesus are different. But at the same time, there's a compatibility with the structure that you're thinking about Christ risen, Christ in glory, sending his light to you, flooding you with light, filling your whole heart and soul with light. And then in the time of the Spirit, in the Holy Spirit, in the Pentecost, you are also receiving this light, and now you want to send it out to other people. Go tell the good news to the poor. Tell prisoners that they are prisoners no more. Tell blind people that they can see. And set the downtrodden free. I can't think of anybody with such a clear sense of activism for social justice than in those lines. He sent, tell prisoners that they are free. Tell blind people that they can see. And set the downtrodden free. Like when I am filled with Christ, that's what I'm being told to do. So you can see how being with Jesus and following his beautiful path of storytelling through his life, through the readings all through the year, you can see how that leads you to this extraordinary moment where he's rejected, where he's crucified, and where the followers of Jesus realize, that's not the end, that's actually the beginning. You know, that beginning is the darkness of Good Friday, the darkness of crucifying God. And he's dead, and he's dead. And then through some mysterious psychic gathering up of all in hell, all the darkness in the world, the cosmos is transformed. The Christ is risen. He is the Christ now. He is Jesus who became this Christ. And then, from then, there's this next journey. So he's there radiant with light, bringing us this light. And that being a very, very intimate moment of prayer where you go over the threshold within your own private world, where you sit still, where you have your private 5 minutes every day, sitting at the window looking out at the grass, whatever you're doing, in the garden, in the church, in the synagogue, in the whatever. You go alone and you hear the light of Christ. And the next bit of it is share that light. And you share that light with your church. The people that you share that with, if it's in a prayer group, there's an intimacy that will develop. And you're really sharing in a very intense way, emotionally, your faith. Or you can do it at any level of subtlety and privacy that you want. You can go to, as far as I'm concerned, and you might obviously disagree if you just want to hold on to one truth about Christianity, but for me, I have lived through Buddhist experiences. I've used Buddhist language to help me be a better Christian. I do sing the joy and gratitude I have for being a priest now in a way that I wouldn't be doing this if I had not met the Rinpoche, the Panchanutra Lama in Jampiling, because the skills and the wisdom and the teachings of Buddha work for me like a scaffolding of intellectual clarity around my Christian faith. So I feel very grateful, and I recognize that crossing the threshold is simply listening, being still and listening for the presence of God. But I also recognize that there has to be a way whereby that's shared. And I do it like in the corner of a big cathedral. I'm there in the back corner just for 5 minutes. Or I'm there at a funeral in my parish. Or wherever, these random moments that I step across that threshold of church. Or I go to Jampiling and I have a coffee with somebody else who's there for the same reason, to to learn how to pray. And I do it especially on this podcast. Because in all those moments, I'm sharing not my knowledge, but my actual faith. I'm saying this is the story of my faith. And that's my church. If there's one place where the church is the precious and most kernel centre, it's in the family. That's the little beautiful church that wraps itself around you forever. And if we get to enlightenment, if we get to heaven, if we get to paradise, and we will, I believe we will, it will be together. So only if it's together. And out of that then comes all the teachings about non-violence and compassion and all the rest of it. It's such a beautiful time, this time of Easter to Pentecost. You know, a time of thinking about how this Christ is going to change me. That's what I ask myself. And I don't know. I never know what the answer is, because finally, that there's a way in which the future comes and we haven't a clue. Just exactly the same if I look back when I was cycling around, heading for McGinley's bus with a typewriter on the carrier, back of the bicycle. I had no clue what the world would be like that I'd be living in now. And I always try and think about that when I think about the future. We could be worried about loads of stuff and we might have nothing to worry about at all. And we could have other areas where we don't worry. And in the future, there could be huge problems that we didn't anticipate. And that's the kind of anxiety that you have about the future, which makes for me the sense of having faith, because I couldn't live through that storm of endlessly moving forward without anxiety, terrible anxiety, unless I had faith. And faith in this moment takes away anxiety. And thank you for being here. And thank you for sharing. Bye-bye.